Why do so many people change, only to end up right back where they started? You decide to eat healthier. You stay consistent for a week, maybe even a month. Then one day, you slip. A missed workout becomes a missed week. One unhealthy meal becomes a return to old eating habits. One distraction becomes hours of wasted time. And before long, you're asking yourself the same frustrating question. Why do I always fall back into my old habits? Most people think the answer is a lack of discipline. They believe they failed because they weren't strong enough, motivated enough, committed enough. But psychology tells a different story. Most people don't fail because they can't change. They fail because they expect change to be easier than it actually is. It's a sign that your brain is doing exactly what it was designed to do, and until you understand why, you'll keep fighting the wrong battle, because the problem isn't that you don't know how to change. The problem is that lasting change is much harder than most people realize. Today we're going to explore why people keep returning to old habits, why change feels so difficult to maintain, and what psychology reveals about creating habits that actually last. Because once you understand what's happening beneath the surface, you'll stop blaming yourself and start understanding yourself. Let's start with a simple truth. Your brain loves familiarity, not because familiarity is always good for you, but because familiarity feels safe. The brain is constantly trying to predict what will happen next. And familiar behaviors are predictable. They're comfortable, efficient. They require very little mental effort. That's why habits exist in the first place. Habits allow the brain to conserve energy. Instead of making thousands of conscious decisions every day, your brain automates behaviors that have been repeated enough times. The problem is that the brain doesn't automatically distinguish between good habits and bad habits. It only recognizes what is familiar, which means that even habits that make you unhappy can feel easier than habits that help you grow. This is why change often feels exciting at first. When you start a new habit, motivation is high, you're inspired, optimistic, focused on the future. Everything feels possible. But eventually the excitement fades. And this is where most people struggle, because real change doesn't happen when motivation is high. Real change happens when motivation disappears. Anyone can stay consistent when they feel inspired. The challenge begins when they don't. And that's usually the moment old habits start pulling them back. Here's something most people never realize. You don't break a habit simply because you decide to. The pathways that habit created in your brain don't disappear overnight. Think of it like a trail through a forest. The more often you walk the same path, the clearer it becomes. Old habits are well-worn paths. New habits are barely visible trails. So when life becomes stressful, overwhelming, or uncertain, the brain naturally returns to the path it knows best. Not because it's the best option, but because it's the easiest option. And the easiest option often wins. This brings us to one of the biggest reasons people fall back into old habits: stress. Think about it. When life feels calm and under control, making good decisions feels easier. But when you're tired, overwhelmed, frustrated, or emotional, something changes. Your brain begins seeking relief. And relief is often found in familiar behaviors. The comfort food, the endless scrolling, the procrastination, the avoidance, the habits you've practiced hundreds or thousands of times before. This is why people often return to old habits during difficult periods of life. Not because they've forgotten their goals, but because stress makes short-term comfort feel more important than long-term growth. Another hidden reason people struggle to change is identity. Most people focus on changing behavior. Very few focus on changing how they see themselves. Imagine someone who has spent years telling themselves, "I'm lazy. I have no discipline. I never stick to anything." Even if they start improving, those beliefs often remain. And over time, people tend to act in ways that confirm their identity, because consistency feels comfortable, not just behavioral consistency, identity consistency. If you secretly believe you're someone who always quits, every setback feels like proof. And every setback makes it easier to return to old habits. That's why lasting change isn't only about changing what you do. It's about changing who you believe you are. There's another mistake people make. They expect change to be linear. They believe progress should look like a straight line, forward. But psychology shows that's rarely how growth works. Real growth is messy. You move forward. You make mistakes. You learn. You improve. You slip. You recover. And then you move forward again. The problem is that many people interpret setbacks as failure. Instead of seeing a mistake as part of the process, they see it as evidence that the process isn't working. And that's often when they give up, not because they failed, but because they misunderstood what success actually looks like. Imagine someone trying to quit a bad habit. They stay consistent for 30 days. Then they make one mistake, one bad day, one moment of weakness. And suddenly they think, I ruined everything. So they stop trying. But here's the truth. One mistake rarely destroys progress. What destroys progress is the belief that one mistake means you've failed. Because the moment you believe you've failed, you're more likely to return completely to the old pattern. This is known as the what the hell effect, a psychological tendency where one small setback leads people to abandon their efforts entirely. And it happens far more often than most people realize. Another reason people fall back into old habits is because they focus too much on outcomes. They become obsessed with results, losing weight, making money, building confidence, being successful. But habits are built through processes, not outcomes. You can't directly control results. You can only control the actions that lead to them. And when people become too attached to immediate results, they often lose motivation when progress feels slow. The habit becomes dependent on the outcome, instead of becoming part of who they are. Perhaps the most important thing to understand is this. Your old habits are not your enemy. They're evidence. Evidence of what you've practiced, evidence of what you've repeated, evidence of how your brain has learned to operate. And just as those habits were built through repetition, new habits are built the same way. Not through perfection, through repetition, not through motivation, through consistency, not through dramatic life changes, through small actions repeated over time. Now imagine yourself 1 year from today, not after a perfect year, not after a year without mistakes, but after a year of refusing to quit every time you slip, a year of getting back on track, a year of understanding that setbacks are part of growth, a year of acting like the person you're trying to become. How different would your life look? Because the people who successfully change aren't necessarily more disciplined than everyone else. They simply stop treating every mistake like the end of the story. They understand something most people don't. Falling back into an old habit isn't failure. Staying there is. And that single shift in perspective can change everything. The truth is that change is difficult. Not because you're broken, not because you're weak, but because your brain prefers what is familiar. And the familiarity is powerful. That's why lasting change requires more than motivation. It requires awareness, patience, repetition, and most importantly, self-compassion. Because the goal isn't to become someone who never struggles. The goal is to become someone who keeps moving forward despite the struggle. So the next time you find yourself falling back into an old habit, don't ask, what's wrong with me? Ask, what can this setback teach me? Because growth isn't measured by how many times you fall. It's measured by how many times you return to the path. And every time you return, you're reinforcing the person you're becoming.